I hope it's been a productive morning, and I'm going to finish off the round of lectures by talking about two things. The first half of this is talking about some of the newer guidelines with NIH grants, and then talking specifically about the KL2 program and the grant application. So first off is just talking about rigor and transparency, which are two items that were added sometime, I think, about last year. And because they're newer items, people have had a little bit of discussion and maybe confusion or transition to adapting to some of the new sections. So I did want to just talk about that briefly. The first part is really about concerns over reproducibility and transparency in methods and reportings of findings. Back in the day, we had 25 pages to really discuss all the background literature on what was behind the science that you might propose. But with 12 pages, I think investigators have put in a lot less to their grants, and I think review sections have had a harder time assessing how the science fits in and the rigor around what they have been proposing. So this is part of a response to that. So there really are 4 new areas. And I do recommend you go to the NIH website, which I've given links to at the bottom. But the 4 new areas are premise, design, variables, and authentication. So premise, the main section really is to provide a bigger and more discrete section on the basis of prior knowledge for the proposed research. Design is really making sure that people are very clear about the study design and that they will obtain robust and unbiased results. In the addendum section is the variable section, which is a consideration of the relevant biological variables, and then authentication of biological and chemical resources. So I'm going to really focus mostly on the first 2 items, the premise section and rigor. So this is really what the NIH says is what premise is. It's what is the research that forms the basis for the proposed research question, describe the general strengths and weaknesses of prior research that is crucial to support the application, and then following with how will the proposed research address the weaknesses or gaps in knowledge. This section is not an explicit section of K awards, but it will, and it very well may come up. It certainly is going to be part of a reviews of an R grant, for example. So this is really, I think what they're getting at is what used to be that very long background section of reviewing the literature. And so I wanted to give you my example, because I think still we get questions about what is this really. So the significance section, which has been there before, is really just describing why is this research question important. So an example would be global warming threatens the existence of mankind. That's trying to make this, that's a really important problem, global warming. The premise, what is and what is not known from prior scientific research. So an example would be, prior studies indicate that increasing carbon dioxide levels is the underlying cause of global warming, but we do not know what policies lead to carbon dioxide reductions. And then the innovation section, again, an older section that has been there for a while, and grants, how will a study add to our scientific knowledge? So there you really want to describe what's new about this study and how does it fit in with the old research. So our study will be the first to examine the impact of carbon trading on reducing carbon dioxide emissions. That's the novelty part, that's the new thing, that's new. And then the impact part is that understanding this could guide policies to lower carbon dioxide emissions and slow down global warming. So that's sort of the way I think about it. It's sort of thinking about why is the question important? What do we know? What do we not know? And then how does the proposed research fill that knowledge gap? And I think people have different strategies for how they put this into a grant. But I think most commonly we see people have a very specific set-aside section on significance and then innovation. And then somewhere in there that people put premise. Personally, I've been actually adding a section with the header premise so that no one has to look for it and it's very clear. But I think that the majority of grants, people include in the premise, in the significance section, and in the innovation section. The other big piece is the rigor part. And I don't know that this is really anything new. It's sort of embedded in your approach section, in that your methods, your experiments will prove the points that you want to make, and that you have the best research design and approach, methodology, analysis, statistical plan, interpretation to have a unbiased and most truthful set of results. So these are quotes from the NIH website. Rigor is the strict application of the scientific method to ensure robust and unbiased experimental design, methodology, analysis, interpretation, and reporting of results. It is full transparency in reporting experimental details, and generally this is part of the research plan. These are sort of some of the elements that are listed as elements of the rigor. So study design, do you have a control group, replication of experiments, randomization, blinding, sample size, statistical methods, how are you handling missing data, confounding bias, and confounding variables and selection bias. So I think it's worth having all these ideas in mind and ensuring that when you have your mentors and when you review it carefully, you maybe go through this checklist and make sure that these issues are addressed if they're relevant. I'm not going to spend too much time on consideration of relevant biological variables, but it does come up. Certainly the issue of sex as a biological variable must be addressed, and I see that coming up over and over again in reviews. But there's also other biological variables that should be considered. For example, how does the issue of age, weight, or genetic strain impact your experiments, and it's important to make sure that you include that in your research plan. Resource authentication is outside the 12 pages of your grant, but you should identify any key biological or chemical resources that you're including in your study, and that's a separate one-page attachment. And I just included some specific links so that you can read more if you have any questions. So the remainder is just to talk specifically about the KL2 program. Has anybody in the room applied for the KL2? I know one, two, okay. So I will go through a few of the details, and I will start out by saying that if you are not familiar with the KL2, we have a website and you can read about it, but I'll go through the basics of what this is. So a KL2 is very similar to a K12. The idea behind these they're institutional K awards. So rather than you as individuals applying to NIH and going through an NIH study section, what happens instead is that you take your K award and you submit it to us locally, and then internally we review grants, and then we give out grants. It's usually about 2 to 3 grants a year. Unlike NIH, we just have a 1-year cycle. So every roughly February, we have a deadline, and it gets reviewed for starting in July of that year. So the similarities between an institutional K award, which is what this is, and an individual K or K23, they're very, very similar in structure, certainly in terms of the grant writing, and to some extent in terms of the funding. But I'll go through the differences. Our institutional K award is called KL2. It's through the CTSI. The goal of this is to support the interdisciplinary translational science on campus among the 4 UCLA CTSI campuses. It can be in basic science, in clinical research, or health services. Your proposal does not need to cover all 3 areas of basic clinical or health services. It just needs to be in one of those areas. The structure of the grant is very similar to the K08, K23. The one difference is that typically a K08, K23 is 5 years, and we only provide 3 years of support. The amount of support is also a little different. So we provide $75,000 of salary support plus benefits, $25,000 in research, $4,000 for tuition or coursework, and $2,000 for travel, as well as $1,500 of statistical support from the CTSI stats group. The eligibility is also very similar. You need a doctoral level research degree or professional degree. You do need a faculty title as of July 1st of the start date. And to reiterate, that start date is a hard start date. So if your appointment wouldn't start till September, then you wouldn't be able to apply until the following year. So your faculty appointment would need to be July 1st. I do know that depending on your institution, there may be questions as to whether your title is a faculty appointment. And if you have questions about that, I'm happy to field questions about that. But I will say that the vast majority of the people who have received these grants are in an assistant professor title. Occasionally it might be a clinical instructor title for a year, but there's clear indication that that person would be on a ladder rank tenure track title within the time frame of the grant. You need to have a commitment of 75% effort towards your research and the aims of the KL2. So if you were, say, for example, working on someone else's grant most of your time, unless that work was your work as well and the direction of your research and related to your KL2, then that could be a problem. If you are a surgeon or in a procedural-based specialty, a clinician, there are ways to, in a K08, K23, get exceptions to reduce your clinical time to 50%, and that would be also true for a KL2. However, you really need to let us know if you're going to propose less than 75% time. You need to clear that with us before you submit your grant, just to make sure that there are not going to be any issues there. You do need to be a U.S. citizen or a non-citizen national permanent U.S. resident. A lot of people come up with questions about what if I have prior grants and does that make me ineligible? So you can have a small grant like an R03 or R21, but if you've previously had your own R01 or, say, for example, a project on a P01, then you would not be eligible. If you have been a co-investigator but not the principal investigator on R01, then that would be okay. That's not going to preclude you from applying for a K08, K12, K23. In some instances, some people have had a prior K12 grant, so they've been on an institutional K12, and that can be okay. But you probably should check with us just to make sure. And then also, if you have, if you get the K award, then if you have other NIH funding, then there could be a conflict. So what would typically happen for most of our KL2s, depending on their funding mechanism, you may have to give up other federal funding if you are on the KL2 grant cycle. So future funding. So let's say you get a KL2. What does that mean in terms of other funding? So just like K08, K23s, you can take other R award funding in your last 2 years of your grant. And I don't know if this was discussed earlier, but certainly for the KL2, let's say you have a KL2. If you apply for an R01 in your second year and then you get it in your third year, you actually can be the PI of an R01 simultaneously with the KL2. But you would take salary support from one grant, not both, and then switch over to salary support once the KL2 falls off. So, but you also couldn't continue on with your KL2 beyond 2 more years, which would probably work out. But for example, if you have a K08 or K23, you can only overlap for 2 years. Let's see, what else? And then, of course, you have to maintain your 75% effort for that first year, and then you can decrease it to 50% effort in that last year. So the selection criteria, again, we've structured the KL2 application to be very similar to a K08, K23. It's 1 page of specific aims plus 12 pages of error approach. And the criteria are very similar: the proposed research, the candidate, the mentor, the educational plan. And while environment is part of that, since we know the 4 institutions, environment usually is not part of a critical portion of your evaluation. Here's just a long list of the components, and it should look pretty similar to what you've seen already today. The one thing that isn't on here is an introduction page if it's a revision, and at this point we haven't had introduction pages if you are resubmitting a KL2, and I don't know that we'll change it, but that's currently what these are the components that we've asked for in the past. So here's the kind of framework for the deadline. We haven't announced the exact dates yet, but generally we do ask for a letter of intent at the beginning of February. That letter of intent is very, very short. It's just your name, your title, your mentors, and your title of the grant. The reason we're doing this is because we have a very short cycle for reviewing, and it takes us a bit of time to find reviewers. So we'd like to get a heads up of the grants that are coming in so that we can find potential reviewers for your grant. I highly recommend, if you submit for the KL2, that you do put in your letter of intent. If you don't, you can still submit, but it may make it more difficult for us in the short timeline that we have to find good reviewers, and that's a critical piece to making sure that you get a fair and honest review of your application. So the application itself is then due at the end of February. We review during April, and we try to notify all of our applicants by early May. Sometimes, though, it gets into middle May or late May. Our goal, though, is to try to get you your reviews so that if you aren't getting funded by us, that you can quickly cycle back and revise your application and submit for NIH study section in June, or NIH deadline in June. And then just the last point, the grant start date is a hard start at July 1st. We really have very little leeway in that, so it needs to start July 1st. And then, of course, in terms of release of funds, you need your IRB and IACUC approvals in place. So probably should try to get those done sometime in the spring after you submit the proposal. I don't know. Has anybody used the CTSI grants library? Yeah. So if you haven't, if you're in this room, you probably should at least look at it. I think it's one of our best resources. If you go to the main CTSI website, you can find links to getting access to it. It's on the front page. If you have any questions or problems finding it, let us know. But the grants library currently contains a wide variety of grants, including K grants, R01s, U grants, also examples of NIH biosketches. This is a secure platform for sharing data. When you go onto the website, you can see the grants. You can't print it, you can't download it, you can't forward it, but you get, for 6 months, access to all the grants there, and you can read through them, and I think it's a great resource to see what's there. Every grant that's there has been funded. So you can get a sense for what the formatting and the kind of verbiage and the syntax and the tone of these grants and see what has worked for others. There is a video that you should watch to see just how to get access. And if you have any problems, just contact us. And this is what it looks like once you're in there, and you can see the list of different grants. Click through it, and they're categorized, or they're grouped into different sections based on grant type, and then also it indicates the type of grant, like whether it's a health services or basic or clinical research proposal. And this is what it looks like. And that's it. So any questions?
I think there have been over 900 hits on the library at this point. Yeah, and so it's one of the resources that your colleagues are really using a lot and finding to be quite useful. And it's a tremendous amount of work to keep it up to date, and we're always adding new proposals and trying to get people at all institutes who've been successful scientists here to let us put their grants up. And so definitely, there's nothing quite like having a successful model when you're trying to do something like this.
I'm going to add one thing, because Dr. Mangini mentioned earlier that we have these more longitudinal mentoring sessions where there's a potentially opportunity to have a set of faculty who would help you more than just once today if you're submitting an application and having it reviewed today, but maybe working with you 2 or 3 or 4 times to see that, help you through that process. The main gateway to doing a studio is by submitting a KL2 proposal. So if you're at that point and you're ready to write a K and you've written a KL2 proposal, it's a good mechanism to get an initial look at your grant. And then we take a subset of those individuals and offer them studios. In addition, if we have extra space beyond that, some of the people who have a polished grant here at the workshop, we might be able to also set up studios. If you're in a position where that timing doesn't really work for you, you should certainly come and talk to us and ask us if there's an opportunity to do this. We do have limited spots available, so we don't always say yes. But if you submit for the KL2 program in February, then it increases your chance. Again, if you have any questions about that or want to participate, just let us know, and we'll do our best to try to fit you in.
Do you have any rules of thumb for how to evaluate if you are going to be a competitive candidate for the KL2 program?
How to evaluate whether you're going to be competitive?
Yeah, for us to evaluate.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm happy to meet with you individually just to kind of go through your CV, and you can send me your biosketch and I can take a look. The first step is certainly to talk to a mentor. You've heard a lot today about choosing the right mentor, and usually for most people, it's a discussion with their mentor about when they're ready. I'm sure you've probably heard that having a mentor who's mentored before on K Awards or has a fair amount of experience in reviewing K Awards can help a lot, and we're happy to help you if you don't really have that expertise. I would say that in general, though, you're at a strong institution. If you have an experienced mentor with good funding, you're probably in good shape. If you have a faculty position and have a few papers under your belt, you probably are in good shape. But to go through the specifics, it probably takes sitting down and really looking through your biosketch and hearing more details about what you're proposing to get a better sense of whether now's the right time and whether you're in good shape to be competitive. And we have a lunchtime today, so we can answer more questions, and we can even ask more specific questions to you and kind of answer a little more nuanced question if you want to talk about your case. Any other questions? Okay, great. So the next step is, I think, lunch, and we have a lunch discussion in groups. They're smaller groups, so you can ask more questions of us. And then I do welcome and encourage you to stay for the afternoon workshops where we're going through grants. I know that we're not going to review everybody's grant in this room, but there's a lot that you get from seeing other people's grants reviewed and getting a sense for the critiques, and I think it will help you formulate your own proposal. So I highly encourage you to participate in one of those sessions. Okay, thank you.
Last word? Oh, any other last words? That's it?
Yeah, I think so. Are you free for lunch?
Yeah.